game I played a couple of weeks after the previous game, again in the Tynedale League, and this was against Jeremy Handley, who's graded 151. And there's going to be a link on the screen because I played a game with Jeremy last year, again in November, which was analysed in fact by Jeremy Silman on the chess.com website with a full article, which was really nice. It just made a really nice Christmas for me because I play a horrible game and I just got a whole raft of annotations and tips on improving. So you'll be able to check that out through that. And in this game I was white. Again, it was 90 minutes for all the moves. And I remembered that Jeremy played the Sicilian, but I didn't have any idea which one it was. So e4 c5, knight f3, knight c6, which may be shadowing an accelerated dragon, or a Sveshnikov, or even just a transposition back into the classical. d4, c takes, knight f6, and knight c3. And with d6, black goes into classical lines. White responds with bishop g5, which is the Richter-Router attack, quite a sharp line, seen in top-level chess for a number of years now. But with the introduction of the move e5, we go into the territory of the Sveshnikov, which for a long time was considered unplayable at top level, until I think it was in the 70s, Latvian Grandmaster Yevgeny Sveshnikov introduced an innovation which we'll come to later on. And of course the key feature of this opening is that black has created a giant hole in his position on d5. So basically white has a very clear route 1 game plan throughout the entire game, which is to occupy d5, remove the defenders of that square, and ideally reach an endgame where there's a knight on d5 against only this dark squared bishop. Because in that scenario, black will have very few chances for counterplay indeed. He'll be deprived of the activity that he so craves from playing in such a dynamic way. Now there's a forced line here. We play the knight from d4 to b5, and after a6 we reroute it back to a3. And this does actually represent a loss of tempo, but the idea is that eventually we're going to play the knight either to c4, c2, and swing it around to e3. And immediately we just set about controlling this d5 square. Now, I had a game actually in this line, albeit a tempo behind, against David Openshaw in the under 180 British Chess Championship, and that came from a different move order where basically white forfeits a tempo to still get into this variation. And we'll see that game later on. It was quite a difficult game actually. I was quite pleased to hold a draw. Now here, bishop to e6 was played, which is the old pelican bird variation. And it was in fact this move and others like it that caused this not to be used at top level chess until b5 came along. And after b5, the main line would run knight to d5, occupying straight away. And then after bishop e7, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, c3, important move, clearing the way for the knight to come here and also stopping any shenanigans, occupying d4. Castles, knight c2, bishop to g5, striding for activity, and a4. And this is a very tense position. It's one that basically is going to result in the better player winning over the board. After bishop to e6, however, white has a chance to seize the donut and gain time. We have two choices. We could play bishop to c4, immediately trying to exchange off this pair of pieces that control d5. However, after bishop to d5, this isn't quite as optimal, because believe it or not, white doesn't want this many pieces on the board necessarily. These knights are a bit clumsy, they're tripping over each other, and black has gained some time to begin some queenside counterplay. With this in mind, white seizes donut and plays knight c4, immediately eyeing a potential weakness of this backward pawn on d6. This means that black is now effectively committed to taking on f6 with the g-pawn. And the idea for him there is to create some structural weakness on his kingside in order to gain a central pawn majority, to batten down the hatches on e4, and to march forward with some counterplay with his two bishops. Bishop takes c4 would not be as good a move. It's true that both the knight and the bishop were controlling d5, but Well, let's just put it this way, black doesn't want to be getting rid of his light squared bishop so easily, because he's now created some more weaknesses in position, notably f7. So instead, we just put the bishop where it needs to go on e7. Now the next move is bishop takes f6. And if you're wondering why white doesn't play knight to e3 straight away, that's a very good question. And give yourself a few minutes to pause the video, have a look at the position and see why this is not such a good move here. And hopefully you came up with the excellent move knight to g8, which looks ridiculous because we're undeveloping a piece, supposedly losing time early in the opening. But bear in mind, this is a closed pawn structure. There is no tension between these pawns. Black does not need to worry about every single tempo. And the idea here is simply that this bishop on g5 is now trapped, it can't escape, so it's going to have to exchange. But after knight takes e7, black has made a clear improvement in comparison to the stem position. He now has an extra piece controlling d5, and he no longer has this weak bishop. He probably stands fairly well here. So for this reason we take on f6. And unless black was a 2200 player trying to take me for a ride, he would immediately reject bishop takes f6, where after knight takes d6 check the king moves, and it's very difficult. So g takes was played. And now we just get on with the plan and play knight to e3. And already we can see that black is quite stuffed up here, he needs to seriously think about liberating his pieces. When I was thinking about a general plan here, I figured I should be keeping hold of the light square breakpoints, which in this case will be d5 and f5, and try and attack kingside, although I reached a general conclusion on the precise means. For black, I was interested in simply trying to save the position, and considered that probably some combination of queen to d7 and bishop to d8 was likely, trying to get f5 in as swiftly as possible, since without this, his position will probably rot. So if we look at queen to d7, well, white's probably simply going to play the knight into d5 straight away, no reason not to. And after bishop d8, bishop d3, it looks a bit awkward, but at least black is trying to make the most of his pieces. In fact, when this position is reached in games between masters, there are a few. The most common move is queen to a5. And after bishop d3, knight b4, white allows the exchange of his bishop in order to gain some time in the centre. And it's basically going to be a question of can black open up without provoking too many weaknesses. And mostly it's very difficult to do that indeed. Perhaps for that reason Jeremy decided to castle, which is a perfectly reasonable move. And here I decided to have a little bit of a think, try and come up with some precision for my plan. I originally looked at g3, but then queen to d7 looked like it improved his position, since it's not entirely clear that my queen should be posted to h5, but if I don't post it to h5, I'm going to have to play h4, which weakens my kingside structure. The reason for this is that black is now actually threatening to play a move like bishop to h3, which would be a serious intrusion and penetration on my kingside light squares, which would probably in practical terms make up for this control of d5. Accordingly, we just played bishop to d3 in the game. Knight to d4 is something I can't really stop, and if black plays knight to b4, as we see here in the game, we don't actually need to worry about it, because as we said before, both these pieces are capable of controlling the d5 square. So this is an equal exchange. This does not really benefit black very much. If instead he plays d4, then we simply play the knight into d5 with c3 to follow, and things are not looking very nice. I rejected a3 at this point, simply on a practical basis, because it might be that the knight belongs on c6, in which case we've suddenly gifted black a half tempo, and there's no reason to be giving black Christmas presents in the middle of November. Again, we don't want to play bishop to e2, because this interferes with the power of the queen, and as we've said, this is an equal exchange anyways. So in the game, white castles. Well, rook to c8 came in, standard Sicilian move, possibly ideas of sacrificing on c3 to break this deadlock in the centre. And now a3 was played, knight takes, queen takes, and again, queen to d7 really has to be looked at. We simply have to do everything we can to fight for these light squares, which we can do after f4, queen to c6. As it was, b5 was played, which again looks standard enough, but where is the pawn going? And at this point white jumps into the hole with knight c to d5, and already has a very commanding position indeed. Well, rook e8 was played, liberating the queen for some queenside activity perhaps, also with the idea of swinging the bishop around, like in the Ruy Lopez, either to g7 to solidify e5, or more likely to h6, because if we have both bishops attacking both knights, we have a serious chance to exchange one of them and push through with d5, possibly even as a pawn sacrifice. If we look at the position, it's completely closed right now, because there are no pawn breaks, there is no pawn tension. So if black can at least have one bishop against a knight and be a pawn down, it's going to be an improvement. Following the plan, f4 was played, and of course what black should definitely not do is take on f4, because after rook takes f4 we have clear targets on f6 and d6, which is now isolated, and we have a kingside attack free of charge. He could try bishop f8, but again f5 is going to come in, locking the centre. Bishop takes, knight takes, bishop h6, but again black has a lot of work to do. If f5, white simply takes. Takes, bishop h4, but again it's pretty clear that black doesn't have any compensation here. So king to h8 was played, clearing the g file potentially for the rook as well. And I should probably just play a4 here, which is a standard Sveshnikov and Ruy Lopez manoeuvre, just trying to break down the queenside pawns, gain an open file for the rook. At the time I decided simply to play f5, because I was down to about 30 minutes on my clock, and Jeremy had about 40. So we're only on move 18, we've got a lot of moves to play. I may as well just force his hand with bishop takes d5, and knight takes d5. And now we can see that if we only remove all these major pieces, we're going to have a very strong endgame. Rook at c5 would probably be the best that black could do here. b4, rook to c6 would come chasing him away. Instead, we played rook to c4, but this merely forces the standard Sveshnikov move c3, preventing any penetration. Queen to b8 was tried, and b3 is playable here, but I simply wanted to keep my pawns intact, and played rook f to d1 instead, ganging up against this d6 pawn for future use. Bishop to d8, desperately trying to gain some activity on this long diagonal with threats of check. Queen to e3 came, stopping that entirely. And now rook to c5, which is of course a good move, because if we notice here the king and the queen are lined up against each other. So if white does something silly like h3, black can take this knight, removing the guard against the pin threat of bishop to b6. This would not be a good idea. Accordingly, white plays the queen back, but this time to e2. The idea being simply to keep hold of some of the light squares, and possibly to be able to break with a4 or c4 later on. We also want to keep a firm hold of this pawn on e4, since it is technically backwards. Now, black here actually takes on d5 anyways, which in a game is a good practical decision, but is probably a little bit early because he has actually got chances to organise some counterplay. He sacrifices the exchange in order to remove the bind on d5, but after rook takes d5 it's not clear that this has been achieved, and although it looks like black has some access to some nice squares, the illusion is short-lived. If queen to b6, king f1 would come, but instead black plays rook g8, and I have to be honest, I don't really understand that move, although computer engines tell me that it is the best move that can be played. It just seems to me that the rook is going nowhere, a stone statue destined to do nothing. Now, if we look at this game positionally from here, we can see that black's bishop is his only unique imbalance. It's on a dark square, so consequently it follows that if I can freeze these pawns here on light squares, it cannot take any part in defending them. This gives me maximum chance to stab away at black's weaknesses. And there's no penetration point in my position either for any of his major pieces. Originally the plan would be to bring the king to f3, to nanny the pawns on e4 and g2, and ideally if I could, bring the queen all the way up to c6, although immediately there's no way of doing this. But this does motivate the entire queenside plan here, with b4. Queen to c7 was tried, rook to c1, queen to c6, clearing the way for the bishop. But white isn't worried about this, he pushes through with c4. Now clearly this pawn can't be taken because white's pieces are just going to overwhelm the position. So black tried to give a check. But now white can push further, and the bishop is just locked in. Rook c8 was played, with a slightly cheeky draw over, possibly because the match was already over and because I was low on time. Also, bear in mind that currently I cannot take it because of queen to c1. So the first thing we must do is defend that rook. The best thing black could now do would be to play bishop to c7. And after c takes, bishop b6, white can come through with the deeply positional move rook c to c5. The material balance between the bishops and rooks no longer matters, because white has transformed the position into one where black has no play, and has to deal with this very hungry d-pawn, which is just going to march down the board. Instead of this, black took. And after b takes c5, we have a potential outpost on d6, and black's queen is doing a horrible job of blockading. The worst piece you can blockade with, probably, is a queen. Black would much prefer to have a knight there. If bishop to a7 would now come, then white will force off a pair of rooks, and simply bodge the queen onto a light square, and it's game over. And accordingly, black played queen to b7. The problem with this is that it's a blunder. The pressure's too much. C takes b6 works. Everything's safe and defended. And after queen takes b6 check, king f1, black resigned. So, it's difficult to see exactly what black did wrong there. He played a slightly passive move with bishop to e6, and white was fairly precise in exploiting this up until the early middle game. Probably it would take a very strong master to outplay somebody from this sort of position. So the lesson here is if you're going to play a very dynamic opening like the Sveshnikov, you need to be fully conversant with the weaknesses in your position, and you need to absolutely know what you're going to do if you get into these sorts of horrible structures like this.